All right, everyone. So we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Now, I know that my usual chapter reviews for Boruto 2 Blue Vortex are a little bit different than what you're seeing right now. And the reason for that is because I have, not really had a lot of time lately to actually sit down and fully edit the Boruto, chapter review. And because of that, I've decided to maybe just do this instead. And this is only going to be for this chapter review. So hopefully by the next chapter, when that gets released, it's going to be back to how the chapters are usually done. But for now, I'm going to do this because I don't want to go too long without giving you guys my thoughts on the latest Boruto chapter, all right? Or the latest Boruto 2 Blue Vortex chapter, excuse me. So again, just wanted to give a quick explanation for why this video is a little bit different than what you're usually getting with my chapter reviews. So with that said, and out of the way, let's go ahead and get to this chapter, and I'm going to go ahead and give you guys my thoughts. And this is going to be, again, different from what I usually do. So it's not going to be me, going off of my thoughts that I've written down. It's just going to be, giving you guys my thoughts off the top of my head as we go through the chapter, all right? So this is chapter 19 called Konohamaru, and we've got, Moegi on the cover, and obviously that's going to be important later on in the chapter. So we see at the beginning of the chapter, we've got a flashback between Araya and Shinki, and we find out how this sword that he has, the lodestone sword, was initially created. So we essentially find out that Shinki basically applied his wind style to the sword, and because of that, Araya is now able to essentially manipulate the iron sand. And Shinki's reasoning for doing this is to essentially kind of level the playing field, essentially to basically give himself a handicap to find other ways to make himself stronger, which I actually think is pretty smart because, when you have people like Shinki, people who are born with Kekkei, something that does tend to happen is that they end up over-relying on using their Kekkei. So finding a way to essentially have his ability be nullified so that he actually has to find other ways to get stronger, I think is actually pretty smart. So we find out about that, and we also see a little bit of a hint to something else. And this is going to be important because this does play a part later on in the chapter. We see basically Araya telling Shinki that he needs to pay some attention to Yodo, and then Shinki basically flips it on him and says that, you're the one who essentially should be paying attention to her because that's all you like to talk about. You only like to talk about her. And this is, again, going to be important because it plays into a theme that has essentially been reoccurring throughout these last couple of chapters when it comes to the Konoha and Sand shinobi against Ryu and Matsuri. So we cut back to the present day and we see him basically disable the iron sand that was around Mitsuki. And we see Ryu basically figuring out, or we see him slowly figuring out that, okay, that blade is essentially going to be a problem. And it's basically a counter to his iron sand. And then he immediately jumps into the attack. And then Araya again disables the iron sand that was heading towards them. But one thing that Ryu essentially figures out is that he only disabled the sand in front of him and not the sand that he set up behind him, which he sees essentially coming towards them after he, launches it at them. And then we see a team-up attack between Sarada and Mitsuki, and this is where we see, again, the teamwork between the two, obviously through all the years of them basically working together through, being Team 7. Now, she fires a fireball jutsu at him, which he blocks easily, no surprise. And then we see that it was actually a trick because Mitsuki hit an attack behind Sarada's move, and we see him wrap Ryu around with his Sage Mode chakra snakes. And Ryu, of course, is a little bit surprised by that. But something that happens here, and I think that this is going to be something that is going to bite Mitsuki in the ass later on in the fight, is that we see him slowly walking towards Ryu. Now, this is a mistake because when you're up against someone like Ryu, you can't do something like slowly walk towards him. You have to immediately jump in and try to finish it as quickly as possible. And we actually see it basically backfire against him because the minute Mitsuki tries to attack him again, he immediately counters it by turning his own body into iron sand. So we see again, basically Mitsuki making the mistake that a lot of characters tend to make, which is that they tend to be a little bit too arrogant. They think that, oh, because I've caught them, then that's it. It's the fight, fight's over. But you can't afford to think that, especially again against opponents like Ryu. And essentially they find out that, he turned himself into iron sand and they have to do something quick or he's going to wrap the iron sand around them again and he's going to control their bodies. And here we see where Yodo is going to contribute because she has those, really sensitive ears, and she figures out that in a specific direction, she can hear these sand grains specifically start to come together, and they figure out that, oh, that's where he's going to start reforming. And then Araya uses his lodestone blade to essentially force Ryu to reform. And then Ryu, of course, figures out again that this is another ability, or he figures out again just how much of a counter. Okay, everyone. Sorry, just had to take care of something real quick. But to get back to the chapter, so we see here, Araya using the blade to essentially force Ryu to come back together, and this is where Ryu figures out another ability of the lodestone blade, which is that he can actually control the iron sand. He can not only disperse it, he can also basically force it to come together. And this is where Mitsuki uses the opportunity. He uses the distraction that Araya gave Mitsuki to allow him to land an attack on Ryu, but we can see that it doesn't really do much. It stuns him for a moment. Okay, sorry everyone. Again, I had to just take care of something real quick, but to go back to the chapter, yeah, we see the attack manage to stun Ryu for a little bit, and we immediately see him try to disperse himself again, but Sarada, of course, not allowing him to essentially do that, activates her Chidori and does manage to hit him, but just like Mitsuki's attack, it only manages to stun him for a little bit, and he immediately goes back to dispersing his body into the iron sand. And even Sarada herself admits that the attack didn't really do much damage, that it was too shallow essentially. And then we cut back to Matsuri and Konohamaru, and we see what's going on with them, and we see why Matsuri is so angry, and we see Konohamaru just being a fucking idiot again, not really understanding why Matsuri is so angry with him, and we see him just completely fumbling this mission and not understanding what's going on right here, and essentially just making her more and more angry. And this again fits into the theme of the chapter, which again we'll get to in a minute. And then we cut to Ada, excuse me, I don't know why I forgot her name, but she basically lays out why Matsuri is so angry with him. And she basically says that the reason why she's angry isn't about what specifically she wants to call him. It's more so that they don't have the type of relationship to where she can call him that. That's essentially what she's really mad about. And then we cut to Kashin Koji, and he's asking Ada to give him essentially a report about what's going on in the fight. And she tells him that Konohamaru essentially screwed up, which I don't think Koji was probably surprised by that. He probably saw it in his 10 directions that the most likely situation is Konohamaru was going to screw this up. And then Boruto asks, what's going on with Sarada and the others? Can they actually take down Ryu? And she responds with, well, they're holding their own for now, but it's still too early to see whether or not they'll actually get the win at the end. And basically that they're not in a position to be able to go help Konohamaru at the moment, which is absolutely true. They need to put all their focus on Ryu, because same thing as what we saw with Hidari, where Boruto just flat out told everyone, listen, I need you to put all your focus on him because we need to take this guy down. We cannot afford to underestimate this guy. And he turned out to be correct. And that ended up paying off in the end because they actually listened to Boruto's advice and not underestimated him. And Boruto, hearing what's going on with Sarada and the others, wants to jump into the battlefield, which makes sense for his character. But Koji once again reminds him that, listen, now's not the time for you to rush in there. And I do wonder if this is, again, setting up for something that we're going to see either in the next chapter or maybe in the one after that, where Boruto actually does show up, because Koji specifically says that now is not the time, meaning at some point it's going to be the time for Boruto to get involved, but he can't do that now. And we find out in a minute, because we cut to the Ten Tails or the Shinju's dimension, and we see Jura basically relaying to Hidari and Momushi what he found out about his, I guess you could say, his research trip, to Konoha, or one of the Konoha's bookstores, to find out more about humans and what's going on with them. And he says something like, in his opinion, every life form should only focus on achieving their goal, which is evolution. But he says that one of the weaknesses of humans is that they are societal in nature, and because of that, it causes them to essentially put restraints around them, and they use reasoning to essentially justify why they do that to themselves, but by doing it, they're essentially stifling their own evolution. And Jura even says that it's essentially a side effect of gaining intelligence. Essentially, the more you learn, the more you start to essentially put restraints around yourself, and you're stopping yourself from basically reaching your natural conclusion, your natural evolution. And he talks about how this could be something that could affect them, the divine trees, because they also gained intelligence. Remember, the divine trees, the 10 tails, used to just be a beast that just follows its own instincts. It didn't listen to things like reason and logic and intelligence. But now that they do have it, now that they've basically been given essentially human, character traits, it's going to essentially it's going to potentially affect their own evolution. And Mamushi even says, well, I mean, this is something that's going to affect humans. It doesn't really have anything to do with us. But Jura, again, being the smart guy that he is, essentially says, wait, hold on. Don't just dismiss it. And he says that it's not the only harmful effect of intelligence. It's also emotions like love, which again, we see is a theme throughout this chapter. And not only this chapter, but also the previous chapters. And I even mentioned that in my previous reviews for, the previous chapters and what's essentially going on in this fight that we've been seeing with the Konoha and the Sand shinobi. And then we cut back to Konohamaru and Matsuri, and she's even again proving what Jura said correct, because she herself doesn't understand why her head is essentially full of thoughts of Konohamaru, and she doesn't understand why it's driving her crazy. And she just believes that if she just gets rid of Konohamaru, then all those thoughts will essentially go away. But what she doesn't realize is that if she gets rid of Konohamaru, she's just going to replace it with another pain, because, the way she feels about Konohamaru, if Konohamaru, if something happens to him, it's going to essentially hurt her even more. She's going to find out what happens when someone that you care about is going to, someone that you care about goes away for whatever reason. It's just going to replace with another type of hurt. And she doesn't even realize that that's essentially what she's going to do to herself. And the other awakened Shinju need to realize that there's more to it than essentially what appears on the surface. And then we cut back to, Jura and the others, and he's talking about what happened with the Inoshikacho trio, Team 10, and how they prioritize keeping Himawari safe over even their own safety, which again to them is illogical, because to them, each and every individual should prioritize their own safety, their own evolution, but instead they didn't. They threw that away to prioritize someone else's safety, which again connects to that whole feeling of love. And he even says that what's really shocking is that they knew how stupid it was, but they still didn't care. And we even cut to a panel of Hidari specifically listening to Jura's words right here. And again, just like I said in the video that I released before this about a couple of weeks ago, and talking about how one of the things that we might see with Hidari is basically like there's going to be more to him, more to his character. I talked about how that could essentially lead to him essentially, going up against Code because of what we saw, because of how the panels were structured. And now we're seeing the same thing with him listening to Jura's words. And again, I can't help but feel like they're setting up something with him that has to do with what Hidari is saying, And he talks about how Inojin basically lost his mind and nearly lost his life because of that. And he talks about how that was the root cause of those actions is love. Excuse me. And Hidari even just straight up asks him, what is this love thing? And I'm wondering if in his mind he's connecting it to, him essentially targeting Sarada, and why specifically is that the case? And Jura talks about how in all the books that he's read, it's something that keeps appearing over and over again. And it's not something that has one specific explanation, but he does talk about how whatever it is, if they don't essentially overcome it, it could be the thing that essentially ends up undoing them. Again, possible setup for later on in the story with what's going to happen to them. And again, if you look at the paneling right here, you can see Jura saying this, and in the next panel, you can see Hidari listening to this, which again, this is not done by accident. Everything that you see in a manga page is all done on purpose. This was done on purpose. So they're definitely setting up something with this character. So then we cut back to the fight between Ryu and the other Konoha shinobi, and this is where we see some shinobi tactics at play here, and I absolutely love it because we see Ryu being, formed back, and then we see him basically do the same thing that Hidari did in his fight against Boruto and the other Konoha shinobi, which is basically him bringing out claw grimes. But the difference between what Hidari did and what Ryu's doing here is that he's actually bringing out more. He's not just stopping at a specific number. He keeps bringing out more and more and more of them, essentially to the point where it's too much for them to handle. For Sarada and Mitsuki, for as powerful as they are, it's still too much for them to handle. It's basically like what happened when the Raikage, or the third Raikage in the Naruto manga, we were told when he went up against, I can't remember the exact number, but an entire army of shinobi, and how, as powerful as he was, inevitably that was too much for him to handle, and how even Tobirama earlier, when he went up against an entire group, or I think it was the Ginkaku and Kinkaku battalion, I think they were called, and how even though it was Tobirama who, he was pretty powerful, he went up against an entire group of S-rank shinobi, which was too much for him to handle. It was just too many for them to handle on his own, essentially. That's basically what we're seeing here. And we find out later on that this was all essentially a plan by Ryu to essentially get rid of something that was essentially hindering him. And here is where we see how love essentially could be the thing that ends up being your own undoing. Again, what Jura told the other divine trees, what he told Hidari and Mamushi, because Areya sees Yodo in trouble and he immediately lets his emotions take over and he tries to stop the claw grime that's managed to basically grab a hold of her, But what he sees again is that it was all a trap. The sword gets stuck in the claw grime, and then Ryu immediately shows up, grabs the claw grime, and then throws him away into whatever dimension that he sent him to through one of the other claw grimes, and basically gets rid of the sword. So the sword is no longer in play here. And again, we find out that that was his plan the entire time. And he even tells him that, guess what? Now you have no way to defend against my iron sand, which is absolutely true. Now, the only other hindrance that he has on the battlefield is Yodo, because even if he disperses himself, she still has the ability to hear him. And I think he knows that. So I'm willing to bet he's going to go after Yodo next. And it's possibly going to lead to either Areya's death, which again would connect to what Jura said in this chapter about how love can be your own undoing. And either that, or it's going to lead to something bad happening. But I'm guessing he is definitely going to target Yodo next, because she is someone who could counter his Iron Sand ability, or more specifically offer a counter to his ability. Not the same way that Areya's blade did, but still something that could essentially be a hindrance to him, because she could point the direction to where he is by using her sensitive ears. And the last thing we see in this chapter is Konohamaru essentially about to basically be devoured by Matsuri. Now, me personally, I don't know whether they're actually going to go through with this. And here's the thing. My opinion is that I do think this does need to happen, because one thing that we do need to see is the Awakened Shinju actually win. Okay, we need to actually see them actually get a win in order to raise the stakes. And not only does it accomplish that, but it also answers the question of what happens when one of these Awakened Shinju actually managed to absorb one of their targets. Hidari nearly did it with Sarada, Jura nearly did it with Himawari, and they both, failed because of interruptions from Boruto. Or once once Jura was interrupted because Himawari, gained access to Kurama's power, and then when that failed, he was about to do it again, but then obviously, Boruto came in, saved her, and then went on to save Sarada. So they both failed in their goals right there. And now we've got one of the Awakened Shinju about to accomplish their goal. And personally, for me, I think we do need to see it. And as much as it would suck, because I do like Konohamaru as a character, and it's not that essentially this would be the end of his character, because what was his name? Ikimoto could still write it in a way to where Konohamaru could still be brought back to where he was absorbed by Matsuri, but he wasn't killed. Essentially, it would be the same as what happened to everyone else who got trapped in one of those trees when they were bitten by a clog rime, where they're trapped in a tree but they're not dead. They could still be saved. So they could still bring Konohamaru back and essentially not kill him off permanently, but essentially find a way to do to him what they did with Naruto and Sasuke, where they write him out of the story, again, in order to raise the stakes and also accomplish telling us, the audience, the readers, what happens when one of these awakened Shinju actually managed to accomplish their goal and absorb their target. So there you go. Me personally, that's my opinion of what I think should happen, and whether it will happen, we'll have to wait and see. Anyway, that is going to be it, guys. Those are my thoughts for the chapter. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. And if you guys enjoy this type of video where I just, hit the record and I just give you guys my thoughts as they come to me, let me know about it in the comment section down below by, again, let me know in the comments, and also let me know by hitting the like button, share this video out there, subscribe if you haven't, make sure to ring the bell to be notified whenever I post a new video. And again, I will see you guys for my next review of Boruto 2 Blue Vortex chapter 20, which hopefully will be in the same style as the usual chapter reviews. Bye for now.